Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is the session on faith-sensitive mental health and psychosocial support to displaced populations and people, specifically children on the move. So we really appreciate you being here. Know it's been a long day already, and we have more to go. So we're going to try to keep it interesting, get a lot of interaction and feedback over the course of the next 75 minutes. My name is Andrea Kaufman. I work with World Vision International and have been part of the Partnership on Religion and Development work on faith-sensitive mental health and psychosocial support, which has been a really exciting project over the last few years. And so we're excited to share some about that and some about the different work that colleagues, this really distinguished panel, who I will briefly introduce in a bit, are doing. Globally, more than 70 million children are displaced. That's by war, conflict, climate, economic migration. They have all kinds of legal statuses, but experience increased exposure to violence, persecution, and poverty. They have higher rates of stress, physical and emotional challenges, and that often manifest in toxic stress. And we know from the research and the evidence that this can manifest bodily in physical illness, development delays, relationship challenges, poor educational performance, all kinds of challenges. And we also know that the mental health and psychosocial support system globally is not equipped to respond, the formal system is not equipped to respond to the needs of these children, and oftentimes, particularly children on the move, have a hard time accessing even formal systems when they do exist. We also know that there's a huge and growing body of evidence that children, caregivers, and communities can and do build resilience, that culturally and faith-sensitive approaches to mental health and psychosocial support can really be support for these children and their caregivers. We also know that contrary to sometimes controversial conversations, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Sphere Standards all actually guarantee faith and culturally sensitive support for these children and their communities. So today we're going to learn a lot about what's working. We're going to hear from frontline practitioners, policy types in our panel, and to really continue to work together to find sustainable, locally driven solutions to address the gap in the mental health and psychosocial support needs. We have a very distinguished panel today. Joining us online via recording, via video, is Dr. Kathleen Rutledge from Queen Margaret University. Also, Dr. Mohammed Abu Halal from Syria Bright Future. Nelson Arms Newman from Pastoral de Crianza International. Flavia, who will introduce herself as a co-moderator, and Rachel Miner, the founder and CEO of Bellwether International. So with that, I'm going to pass to Flavia.
Pessoas, obrigada. Boa tarde a todas as pessoas. Sou Flávia Cristina Silveira Lemos, psicóloga, mestre em Psicologia Social e doutora em História Cultural. Sou professora universitária há 25 anos, sendo 16 anos na Universidade Federal do Pará. Atualmente, nos últimos anos, eu estou na gestão, na reitoria da universidade, na pró-reitoria de extensão, atuando na diretoria de relações interinstitucionais, onde eu faço articulação com ONGs, movimentos sociais, organismos multilaterais, poder legislativo, judiciário, executivo, etc. Sou bolsista de produtividade de pesquisa do CNPq no Brasil, com o tema de direitos das crianças e adolescentes no Brasil. Eu fui conselheira no Conselho Federal de Psicologia no Brasil, também fui da Comissão Nacional de Direitos Humanos, do Conselho Federal de Psicologia, fui de várias diretorias de associações científicas de psicologia social e de ensino de psicologia no Brasil. Há cerca de 30 anos eu trabalho com direitos da criança e adolescente e atuo como professora de psicologia social, comunitária e política, saúde mental coletiva, psicologia e políticas públicas. tanto na graduação como na pós-graduação de psicologia. Também tenho formação em graduação em pedagogia. Bom, nesse momento é importante a gente pensar tanto nos dispositivos jurídicos, mas na construção de políticas públicas que possam construir redes de atenção à saúde mental coletiva de crianças e adolescentes em situação de deslocamentos forçados e de movimentos em função de guerras civis, guerras mundiais, ditaduras, eventos climáticos, entre outras situações, como o tráfico de pessoas, situações adversas, perseguições políticas, que, de certa forma, vão atingir com maior vulnerabilização crianças e adolescentes. No caso do Brasil, nós temos dispositivos importantes de proteção a todas as crianças e adolescentes nas políticas públicas que são universais no Brasil. Então, elas são para todas as crianças e adolescentes como sujeitos de direitos, independentemente da nação. Crianças e adolescentes que estiverem no Brasil terão acesso ao Sistema Único de Saúde e à rede de atenção psicossocial no Brasil, onde essas crianças e adolescentes poderão ter acesso à saúde mental coletiva, porque no SUS, Sistema Único de Saúde no Brasil, a saúde mental não está apartada da saúde coletiva. Há um princípio no SUS no Brasil, no Sistema Único de Saúde, que é a universalidade. Então, todas as crianças têm acesso, independentemente do país, da localidade, independentemente dos marcadores de gênero, de étnico-raciais, classe, etc., etarismo, território. E no SUS nós temos redes. Essas redes, no caso da saúde mental e coletiva, estão assentadas no dispositivo de equidade, dispositivo de integralidade, em que nós não separamos as ações de saúde mental de outras políticas públicas, e nós, no Brasil, atuamos com um princípio de que há determinantes sociais e econômicos da saúde também. A saúde mental não é algo apenas individual. E nós temos o Estatuto da Criança e do Adolescente, encerrando, que ele garante proteção integral a todas as crianças e adolescentes. Então, ele também pode ser aplicado à proteção integral de crianças de outros países e adolescentes em situação de deslocamento forçado. Portanto, é importante a gente pensar que não há saúde mental coletiva dissociada de garantias de direitos humanos e das diferentes políticas públicas. Que a gente possa, então, encerrando, promover a atenção à saúde mental coletiva, garantindo todos os direitos das crianças e adolescentes, especialmente aquelas que se encontram em maior vulnerabilidade, apesar de todas elas serem sujeitos de direitos no Brasil e todas elas terem direitos a todos os direitos garantidos na Constituição Federal de 88 e no Estatuto da Criança e do Adolescente. Muito obrigada. Passo a palavra, então, para Rachel Maier.
Thank you. We're going to move now to a video, and we're going to hear from Dr. Kathleen Rutledge.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kathleen Rutledge of the Institute for Global Health and Development at Queen Margaret University in Scotland. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I am grateful to have the privilege to talk to you a bit about faith-sensitive mental health and psychosocial support. That's a lot. So we're going to unpack a bit what those terms mean and essentially why it matters and why we're talking about it today. First of all, I just want to clarify a little bit about terminology. Well, first, mental health and psychosocial support includes all of the catchment of the types of supports we provide for people affected by crisis and displacement to improve and support their well-being. So everything from clinical care is more the mental health side to investments in strengthening protection, access to basic needs, social support and networks, individual coping, and then the more tailored focus support. So it's the catch-all term for all of those things. And when we're talking about faith sensitive, we're talking about adapting those standardized activities to the faith and cultural priorities of the individual. So it's essentially, if in assessments, we identify it's a priority for individuals to have certain types of supports, then we make the space for that and try to enable that practice to happen. Faith-based is slightly different. Faith-based is a little bit more about the content that is sort of pre-described or pre-prescribed. And so it's like perhaps including sacred text, for example, maybe in a curricula that you want to use with a group. You'd include the same sacred text that you'd share with all groups. That's a slightly different approach. So what we're actually talking about today is more of the standardized approach that adapts one by one and adapts to households and families, and also does not include elements of faith and culture if those are not priorities or of interest to the individual. Why are we talking about this? One of the main reasons is that the majority of the world's population, 8 in 10 children, have some sort of affiliation with faith. And so part of what that means is that the way in which people make meaning, the way in which they cope, the goals in life, for many people, these are shaped by kind of a spirit-infused world that if we aren't able to seek to understand and connect with, we're likely to have less effective programs in supports, and also likely to be less effective in really meeting the needs that are there in terms of mental health and psychosocial support. Additionally, it's a human right. It's in rights conventions for children and adults that we are meant to make space for, ensuring that they have the ability to access the supports they need and that they're supported to practice their religion individually or in community. Additionally, it's also in humanitarian principles and guidelines across the board, from the very basic, humanitarian charters that set the values for the industry, to the very specific guidelines from WHO or the United Nations guidelines for MHPSS and emergency, or SPHERE, which sets the standards for everything from water and sanitation, hygiene, to nutrition, to all of these different aspects. The minimum standards are included in the SPHERE standards, and all of these say we need to be aware of people's priorities and needs related to culture and faith, and we need to adapt accordingly. One example of an article that enshrines the right of a child to faith-sensitive supports includes the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 27, that includes spiritual development as a part of what every child has a right to. Likewise, the United Nations guidelines on MHPSS have very specific provisions, directing responders to ensure that we facilitate conditions for they communal and spiritual practice, that we identify the supports that people use, and that they engage in their coping, whether it's people of faith, materials, particular belief systems, or foods, or spaces that they need. But we will also remove the obstacles, even if those are sometimes our own prejudices, and that we ensure that we have enabled the faith practice to the degree possible. Another reason that faith-sensitive MHPSS is considered good practice is because extensive research has shown that if these types of supports are made available at the time that people are experiencing conflict and displacement, or recovering from a natural disaster, this is the time when they can actually help to, this type of resources can help to buffer long-term mental illness and long-term physical illness that one typically sees among those affected by conflict and displacement. And similarly, it's standard practice that for all people who are displaced, one of the things that we focus on is trying to help them to stabilize, have a sense of safety and security, and also have a sense of familiarity and normalcy, even amidst the chaos, to the degree possible. And as we've said before, the majority of the world's population has some sort of cultural or faith affiliation. So familiar practices for coping, for living, for socializing, for supporting oneself, for many people are related to faith and culture. So part of our job is to help to be sure that they have access to the things that were normal for them previously. And additionally, if we do this successfully and help people to heal from trauma, to restore trust, there is a strong connection between that type of healing and preventing cycles of long-term violence. So there's a strong connection between doing MHPSS well and long-term social cohesion in contexts of fragility. So acknowledging the importance of faith-sensitive and culturally sensitive and adapted MHPSS, PARD over the last couple of years has been working on several different activities to strengthen what's available to children on the move and to their caregivers and to adults. And the policy brief that's going to be talked about today is one part of that. And over a period of about a year, more than 54 agencies, governments, United Nations, academics, non-faith-based groups, faith communities, clinicians, they all came together to discuss what is the way forward, what are the barriers, what do we need to do next to ensure that actually we can offer children on the move strengthened support for their mental health and well-being that is adapted to their faith and culture.
Thank you, Dr. Rutledge. I know she really did want to be here, but I think she's on a beach somewhere, so it is August, vacation season. Self-care, exactly. We are going to transition. We're going to start on the other end and work our way this way, hearing from our panelists just about their experiences. I mean, I mentioned and introduced them very briefly, so if you guys want to give a little more of a bio before you start sharing your experience, please feel free. And we just want to hear about your experience, your frontline work, and the way that faith-sensitive MHPSS interventions, you've seen them support children and their communities on the move. We're going to start with Rachel.
Okay, yeah, I expected to go last. I prepared my comments in the context of your policy brief, but that's fine. Up to you.
Because I think your slides are next. It's a
Okay,
logistics
great.
challenge.
Yeah, here's an overview of the policy brief they're going to discuss. Basically, as it stands, mental health psychosocial support can be faith sensitive, and it's not right now. It should be, but it's not. There's a couple of major barriers: language translation, training for local peoples, and basically just using evidence-based practice as it stands. So I'm going to tell you about where it's working, and I'm going to share some success stories from our programming in Iraq. So a little bit about our organization. Bellwether International's mission is to disrupt the cycle of genocide. And it is a cycle. Just as there's a poverty trap, there's a genocide trap. And countries that have experienced genocide in the past are 66% more likely to experience genocide in the future. So if any country has experienced a genocide, they get locked into these practices where trauma, unresolved trauma, leads to unstable economies, which when there's a shock to the economy like COVID or a global financial crisis, my economic thesis shows that actually persecution of targeted minority groups increases by 20%. So there's a link between economic shocks and persecution, and then that persecution quickly becomes othering, organized violence, and then intention to destroy in whole or in part a group of people, which is how genocide is defined in the UN Convention. One of the first conventions passed directly after the Declaration on Human Rights. So I'm going to tell you about real people. These are survivors of the 2014 genocide in Iraq, and they belong to a faith group called the Yazidis. Next slide. Maybe. The Yazidis are a monotheistic group, and they believe in a universal God. They don't have any kind of... All of their traditions are orally transmitted and shared in a community. So they were targeted by ISIS, Daesh, and systematically destroyed. This August is 10 years since that genocide occurred. It is both disturbing and appalling to me that we're even having conversations about contemporary genocide, but you've read about a lot of those in the news recently: Sudan, Palestine, Israel, and again, Iraq. This is a country that's experienced 2 genocides, so their likelihood of having a genocide in the future remains high. So what do? We take a trauma healing framework, and the very first thing we do is we adapt it to the local context. We do not bring in Western medical assumptions about what mental health should look like for the Yazidis in a post-genocide community. And the very next step in adapting anything is a translation process. A translation process that is led by the community where we operate. So we don't hire external translators, we hire internal translators. We hire the people who are going to be using the framework as our translation team. Then, instead of flying in a psychologist or a psychotherapist, we actually have modified all of our frameworks so that they don't require prescribing. And in that way, we can train local staff in entry-level social work and MHPSS best practices. They pilot sessions based on their wants, based on their needs assessment, based on our impact evaluation. And then only after all of this do we actually implement and scale. So piloting becomes really important in faith-sensitive projects because you need a lot of input and a lot of feedback. So this is the RHS-15. This is a World Health Organization validated screener. That means it's evidence-based. It's been validated in research context using randomized control trials. This is a trauma survey. So they fill out this trauma survey before they start our program, and that gives us a snapshot of where they are. We do this pre-survey, we pilot the trauma, use this same RHS-15 for the post-survey, and then we evaluate. And then we use cognitive-based therapy themes, again, based on a needs assessment. So what do the Yazidis want? This is their list of themes. Our framework can be adapted based on whatever they're experiencing. As it turns out, the Yazidis are really struggling with sleep disturbance, insomnia, anger, some of these other components. They selected these themes based on conversations we had in the community, based on working group sessions. This is what it looks like. Notice how everyone here is Yazidi. This is Yazidis helping Yazidis with a framework that they developed together. So they have the ownership, they have the stewardship, and they have all of the resources they need in this room to succeed. This is one of my most favorite pictures in the whole world. So just to give you a sense of the numbers, the blue bar is the pre-test survey. The higher your score, the higher your trauma. So on average, people before completing the sessions are scoring almost at the very top. They're completely incapacitated by their trauma. Versus the red bar, which is after our sessions. They are completely healing. Not completely, but they are healing enormously from these trauma sessions. And I'll share these slides with anyone who's interested, so you can look at some of the other numbers. We have a 37.5% improvement rate, which for those of you who are practitioners in the mental health space, is pretty much unheard of. These are testimonials, we'll skip that. In the end, 100% of the women who have participated in our program report improved mental health outcomes. 100%. We've piloted our faith-sensitive program with 300 Yazidi women. Yazidi women helping Yazidi women. And we've started a youth pilot, which the numbers are holding for as well. So this is just a quick snapshot to show you not only is it possible, it works 100% of the time. Funny how when you adapt something with the community, they know what their families need. And they know how to take those resources and implement them. So I know our time is short. I'll turn it back over to you, but just a quick success story to say that faith-sensitive mental health psychosocial support is possible. It is the best practice. It is evidence-based, and it's been validated with the Yazidi community, among others, the Afghan diaspora as well. So thank you so much.
Muito obrigada. E deixa eu passar a palavra para Nelson Arnes fazer sua exposição.
I will speak in Portuguese. In the first time, Andrea, we will understand what I'm speaking. Bom, boa tarde. Eu vou começar falando de um caso para depois a gente extrapolar, digamos, para as lições aprendidas. Tem um município no sul do Brasil, Chapecó, 240 mil habitantes, com 11 mil haitianos e 9 mil venezuelanos, por conta da oportunidade de emprego. Então, a gente selecionou um bairro onde havia uma maior concentração desses migrantes e, com busca ativa, que a gente chama, fazendo as visitas, buscando, naqueles dias, gestante. E apontaram, eu vi uma estrangeira lá, gestante. Quando chegaram na casa, o marido tentando carregar a esposa, 22 anos, que teve um AVC, um derrame. E não sabia para onde ir. Então, a equipe, logo, conhecendo a cidade, levou para a UPA, que é a Unidade de Pronto Atendimento. Lá não sabiam como interpretar, porque não entendiam o espanhol. Então, abriram uma exceção para essa pessoa poder acompanhar o internamento. Conseguiram, fizeram o tratamento, mas um mês depois, quando a equipe voltou àquela casa, a mulher tinha pedido alta antes de estar pronta no hospital, porque não tinha com quem deixar o outro filho de 6 anos. Então, ela tinha 22 anos, um filho de 6 anos, 6 meses de gestação. E tinha acabado de perder a consulta com o melhor neurologista, de graça, dentro do SUS, porque não tinha dinheiro para o transporte. E aí a mobilização da comunidade interreligiosa, bom, quem conhece o município sabe que o município tem um sistema de transporte para pessoas que não têm a capacidade de locomoção. Outro que trabalhava na escola falou, puxa, mas uma criança de 6 anos tem direito à matrícula, ela pode ficar internada. Uma voluntária de fisioterapia começou a fazer a fisioterapia para ela. Outros conseguiram a cesta básica. E então, essa mulher pôde ser tratada e acompanhada. E o mais interessante é que a gente usa um material educativo, todo num aplicativo, portado para o celular. Como a gente também trabalha na Venezuela, Bolívia, nós temos todo esse material em espanhol para ela acompanhar a gestação, o crescimento da criança, brinquedos e brincadeiras que podem ser feitos. Nesse mesmo bairro, uma mulher haitiana, gestante, sentiu-se mal e buscou a unidade básica de saúde. Chegando lá, convulsionou, estava com eclâmpsia, porque não deveria ter procurado a unidade básica, e sim já um hospital, mas não conhece o sistema. Acordou um dia e meio depois da maternidade, sem a barriga, sem saber o que aconteceu e sem falar uma única palavra que conseguisse se comunicar, porque ela só falava o crioulo haitiano e não falava nem o francês. O que a gente fez? Então, primeiro, mobilizar a comunidade para a comunidade oferecer os serviços que já existem do seu ponto de vista. Não somos nós que vamos dizer o que cada um vai fazer. Desde um trabalho pessoal, uma fisioterapeuta dando atenção, até buscar os serviços de governo que existiam. No caso dos haitianos, que era mais complicado, além de ter o material em crioulo, alguém precisava acompanhar na maternidade para a mãe não ficar um dia e meio em desespero até saber que a criança desce da UTI e está viva. Então, a gente conversou com a Associação de Haitianos para colocar tradutores no hospital para a equipe médica. Só que no Haiti não tem, só tem 2 hospitais que não são pagos, para o país inteiro, 10 milhões de habitantes. Eles não conhecem o que é ambiente hospitalar. Então, uma parceria com a Universidade Estadual, o Departamento de Enfermagem, o que é? Eles fazem a capacitação de como é que se portam no ambiente hospitalar. Depois que fizeram a autoavaliação, vão para essa universidade que tira as dúvidas de como se portar para quando chega na maternidade, que no Brasil sempre está sobrecarregado, o pessoal da enfermagem de lá simplesmente explica o ambiente. Eles já estão preparados para estar dentro do hospital e dar apoio tanto para quem está internado, na questão da gestação, quanto para a equipe médica que quer acompanhar. Acabou o tempo. Obrigado. Não acabou? Não vi a plaquinha. 30 segundos. Qualquer dúvida, vocês me perguntam depois.
Muito obrigada. Passa a palavra, então, para Mohamed fazer a sua fala.
Okay. So, what was the question for me?
Tell us about your experience.
Yeah. So, thank you very much to allow me to speak, and thank for my colleagues who talked before me. I'm a psychiatrist, and I had to flee from Syria after the revolution in 2011 to Jordan. And since then, I start to know about working with NGOs, and we volunteer to provide psychosocial support to the families, Syrian families in Jordan. And then we established an organization, Cerebral Future, which is specialized in mental health and psychosocial support. And we start to partner with the international NGOs to provide services, different kind of activities, psychosocial support, mental health, psychiatric care, social interventions, protection, and all these activities. And then I moved to Turkey and continue our work to inside Syria in the areas that we call liberated area, which is out of the regime control. So we were working in mental health according to what we have learned from INGO and from UN agencies. And 2019, we had a European German psychotherapist, and she asked me, can you show me some books that you use or you have worked on? So I show her one of the books that has been translated. She said, this is translation. Don't you have something from your culture or from your work? So then I start, no, we don't have. And then she told me that there's an initiative looking for this faith or culture adaptation, and it was between Lutheran Federation and Islamic Relief. So I followed the link that she sent me, and then they, after a few months, they sent this, a book about guidelines how to include mental health, faith in mental health and protection programs. I felt like why we didn't have this chance to have a faith-sensitive approaches from the beginning? Why really late till this, after maybe 8 years, to know about that? And since then, I started working on that, and I did a lot of work on research and building capacity and webinars about how to adapt mental health to the culture. And then I searched more, and I participated more, and somebody also has introduced me to BARD, and I became part of BARD. And then I had this chance actually to meet with a lot of wonderful people here. So this is like my story, and I remember that I supposed to say why it is important to include faith into the programs of children. I think this is, is like very easy actually, because it maybe become more effective if you use faith with compared to not using faith, because he can relate more to these programs. Second, also, you can help him to understand the culture, and that give him a sense of belonging to the community, and also cohesion with the adults in the community. And also, you can correct some, cultural mistakes, let's say, that is in raising the children. So this is an opportunity actually to counter some misconception or mispractices for the children. So I think this is like very important. I know time will finish, but I will continue later on about the problem of you find in guidelines the importance of taking culture of the communities into consideration. But theory is something and application another story. I hope that we can talk about it later. Thank you.
Thank you. I think let's go right back to that and let's hear from the panel. Why you said we didn't have it. It wasn't really even on your radar in terms of the faith-sensitive approaches. What do you think those barriers are, and what are the opportunities that we have to overcome? Maybe start with you and then go to.
So I hope this will be a safe space to talk, and forgive me to any sensitivity that I will bring up, but this is like very important. Now I work in northwest Syria, where all people there, almost 99%, share same culture, same religion, same sect, same social traditions. But we are not allowed, if I see a patient or a client, to use any faith or religion content in that. So I appreciate what my colleagues has done in Iraq, but this is a problem of the system, where the system is care about minorities, which is good, but he forgets about majority, which is happening. So and I asked people, I did a survey, why you don't want to use faith? So the answer was, they are fearing to link that to terrorism. And like Islam is labeled as terrorism, or it is known about that. So they fear of that. They fear that there will be a cut of fund if you use this. They fear that you will lose neutrality if you use that. So people are afraid from doing this. So this is some of the barriers. And again, UN agencies, INGO, they give very great guidelines. But when it comes to practice, because it's this bureaucracy and dynamic and a lot of factors, when it comes down to the application, it's become sometimes like not only not effective, but also sometimes it's harmful. So people are just, the way they see the mental health and psychosocial support is different than what we hope. And one example, when one organization dare to provide faith counseling with psychosocial counseling, so there's two teams. So when psychosocial team goes and say we are psychosocial team, people say no, we don't want this, okay? But when they say we are faith team, like spiritual counseling or faith counseling, they will be more receptive to them. So this is actually the situation where I work, and maybe we can talk more, but I think this would be enough for this. Thank you.
É bem interessante porque essa venezuelana, a princípio, perguntou: por que vocês estão me ajudando? E a resposta foi: nossa religião pede para ajudar o estrangeiro. Mas, não, religião não importa, a gente atende a todos. Isso deu uma abertura muito grande, porque você, num país estrangeiro, você sempre se sente muito vulnerável, e saber que alguém está fazendo isso em nome ou a pedido de Deus facilita as questões. E o principal depois é que quando você tem um grupo grande e constante chegando, é aproveitar essas pessoas ou elas mesmas pedirem para fazer parte e fazer com as famílias delas, da cultura delas, daí já não brasileiros fazendo para haitianos ou para venezuelanos, mas eles mesmos e tendo um suporte da comunidade local. né? Porque a gente sabe, isso tá provado, que a condição de maior vulnerabilidade não é a pobreza, é a migração. Porque mesmo quem tem dinheiro, se eles tivessem, não tinham, mas com quem fica com a criança se o marido está acompanhando uma esposa grávida com AVC? A criança agora tem 1 ano, está muito bem, né? Ela recuperou bem a mobilidade. Então, a gente vê como uma intervenção no momento adequado e a exemplaridade sobre todas as comunidades e as diversas religiões podem ajudar, inclusive no trabalho conjunto.
I'll just add some thoughts here. The greatest challenge is trust. If you're going to work at a community level, people are not going to trust you initially. They're not going to trust your programming, especially in the Middle East, right? You say the words mental health, immediate stigma. Unfortunately, if you come in with any programming that's affiliated with the Western world, there's distrust. If you come in with anything that looks or sounds like a white savior complex, there's distrust. And even if there's not, these are real people with real concerns. The globalized world is such that there are no longer pockets of humanitarian need where there hasn't been an NGO before you. And although do no harm should dictate what we do, there is lots of harm. There's lots of harm, and there are a lot of grievances, and there's a lot of trauma from NGOs who have manipulated faith, instrumentalized religion, from politicians who have instrumentalized religion, and this is a challenge. So what I typically tell our donors is, look, it's a larger investment up front. It's going to take longer to establish a faith-sensitive approach. It's going to take more emotional energy to earn the trust of this community. But it will last longer, and it is sustainable, because once you have trust and once you have an evidence-based program, it runs forever. And if it's done correctly, you're not just giving them a program, you're actually transferring human capital to the community. The women who are trained in our program, it wouldn't matter if Bellwether ceased to exist tomorrow. They have those skills eternally, and they can use the framework eternally, and they're not dependent or reliant on someone else. So I think, of course, financing is going to remain a struggle for nonprofits, getting the financing you need to scale and implement. But above all else, these are real people with real lives, and just as you mentioned, and our colleague mentioned in her video, you have to work with a people-centered approach, and that requires trust, and trust requires time. But if you're willing to do that, and you're willing to overcome, I think trust is the greatest barrier, then all those other barriers you can overcome through collaboration and the work that PART is doing and others are doing to work together.
Podemos abrir para perguntas ao público, né? Temos tempo de até 3 perguntas. Se vocês concordarem, as 3 perguntas poderiam ser feitas direcionando a alguém específico da mesa, mas seria importante que vocês se apresentassem, fizessem a pergunta, tentando ser sintéticos e sintéticas. Tá? Muito obrigada.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. Really, really appreciated them. I think just a quick comment to Mohammed in terms of what he shared with regards to his story. I don't think that particular story is just based in your country. I'm from South Africa, and I think that is quite present within the African context as well. I also think that perhaps some of the hindrances for us to begin understanding that faith could have an impact within the mental spaces, because within our training spaces as well, there are clear boundaries with regards to how you actually engage with clients and so forth. And I think that's a terrain that should possibly be challenged as well with regards to how do we bring in the faith strand in that, knowing clearly that mental health is formulated on that basis as well, that spirituality plays a huge role as well. So that's just a comment that I wanted to say. And then with
Qual o
regards...
seu nome?
Oh.
Seu nome? Your
Oh, my
name?
name is Faith, and I'm from South Africa.
Obrigada.
And then, Rachel, I just wanted to find out with regards to the programs, and I quickly asked before you sat down, and I said, where have you implemented it, and you shared. But I wondered within the African context whether you have engaged in that context, and I was quite interested in terms of the reception of it in that context. And I think my interest is seated with the fact that most of the times within the African context, spirituality plays quite a huge role. And I use the term spirituality deliberately as well. And I know we saying faith sensitive, but I'm specifically saying spiritually. So I would be interested to find out if you have worked in the African context and how that has, what was the reception of the actual program thereof?
Yeah, I'll give a quick response.
Just a moment. Essas três
Oh.
perguntas primeiro.
Boa tarde, meu nome é Álvaro, eu sou do Uruguai e eu estudo a inclusão educativa das crianças migrantes. Então, gostaria de fazer uma pergunta em geral, trazendo para este tema das crianças e a educação, e como este apoio psicossocial nesse contexto da inclusão educativa dessas crianças migrantes nos países de acolhida. Se vocês têm alguma experiência a respeito e como tem sido isso. Obrigado.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Meu nome é Manuel Moraes, sou professor da universidade no estado do Pará, fica na Amazônia brasileira. Sou coordenador da cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello, ligada à Acnur, na ONU. Uma das maiores desafios para as atividades da cátedra em Belém, no Pará, são as migrações dos nossos povos Uarau, também dos nossos haitianos e também de venezuelanos. Quando chegam ao Pará, crianças e jovens negociam religiosidades. Ou seja, para ter amparo do Estado, se apresentam dispostos a negociar tanto cultura quanto religião. De que maneira? Falando que estão dispostos a serem cristãos, a uma evangelização para ter saúde e acolhida. A minha pergunta é: como é a experiência de vocês para tratarem com crianças, reconhecendo a alteridade religiosa delas, preparando um cuidado que atenda não só só o que a gente entende por direitos fundamentais, mas também as sensibilidades de corpo, de sensibilidade de saberes e sensibilidade de ambiente que faltam no amparo religioso. Muito obrigado.
Nós voltamos então para a mesa e vocês poderão responder conforme as perguntas foram dirigidas a vocês, tentando ser sintéticos em função do tempo. Temos um total de cerca de 25 minutos. Penso que na medida que vocês forem respondendo, vocês já podem fazer uma fala sintética de encerramento e despedida. Muito obrigada.
Sorry, I jumped the gun. I was excited. Okay, does this work in Africa? It works everywhere. So we have worked with a research working group who has validated the results of this in Turkey, Malaysia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and now we're piloting it in Nigeria. So we'll share the results of that with you. The question about kids on the move. Yes, this framework does work with migrant children, immigrant children. And it also, an interesting point that I want to raise is it doesn't matter when the trauma was experienced. So most of the kids we're working with in Iraq, their genocidal trauma is 10 years old. 10 years. and we're still seeing them heal from that. So it doesn't matter if it's a recent trauma or it's an old trauma, it still is working. And then your question about how do you help kids who are kind of in this precarious situation where identifying with a faith group is maybe not in their economic best interest. Actually, in Iraq, they've passed a series of very difficult identification laws where if you're a child born of rape, you take the religion of the father no matter what. And many of the Yazidis who are born of rape are then identified as Islamic instead of Yazidi. And as you can imagine, in a post-genocide context, that creates enormous trauma and enormous complications. I don't have an answer really for that challenge, except that we work with those kids to first resolve their trauma and then help them find their own identities. And so, yeah, in many cases, they have a dual identity. They have a faith identity with the state, and then they have a faith identity with their community. We've also had to do a lot of interfaith work with the community because it's created a lot of challenges for families who have stigmatized victims of rape. And the Yazidi community at first really struggled, as you can imagine, trying to bring in children that were identifying with Islamic identification cards. But thankfully, the Yazidi Spiritual Council and a lot of local leaders in the Yazidi community have done a lot of work to overcome that and create safe spaces for children born of rape and for women in these situations. But it is very challenging. I think you've come to the crux of one of the hardest issues, which is children in faith, changing faith, conversion, and then kind of the unexpected challenges that come from gender-based violence, and that always affects kids, particularly in the rape context. So I appreciate your question. I wish I had an easier answer, but that is one of the most complicated issues that we see, at least with the Yazidi community.
No nosso trabalho, a prioridade é a trabalhar a comunidade que recebe os migrantes. Então, respondendo a pergunta da escola, uma criança caindo de paraquedas na escola é alguma coisa. Mas, se a comunidade sabe que tem uma criança da Venezuela, que a mãe teve dificuldades, a comunidade está falando, isso ajuda a inclusão, porque os coleguinhas vão receber essa pessoa não como uma pessoa estranha, como parte dela. E nós temos uma atividade que a gente chama de celebração da vida, que uma vez por mês reunimos todas as famílias para, às vezes, pesar, medir as crianças, fazer acompanhamento nutricional, brinquedos ou algo assim, mas o objetivo final é criar conhecimento e laços. Então, por exemplo, da questão da espiritualidade, a gente diz assim, olha, venezuelanos, vocês também têm o costume lá de rezar antes de comer? Sim, então quem vai rezar hoje são vocês. Eu lembro das duas assim, puxa, mas rezar em público, em português... Não, reza como vocês rezam. Elas reuniram e começaram a cantar, e o pessoal do Brasil, puxa, mas é a mesma música que a gente canta aqui, só que com... Você percebe que português... Então, para treinar a comunidade, ou capacitar-los para entender a questão da diferença. Quer dizer, olha, a gente respeita e não pergunta, né, a que religião você pertence. E até a preocupação deles, mas eu preciso me converter para a igreja, eu falei, não, não é esse o nosso aspecto. E todo esse trabalho, esqueci de dizer, é voluntário. Quer dizer, não tem pessoas pagas, porque são pessoas que vivem próximas das comunidades onde vivem e dedicam parte do seu tempo. Então, a carga não é tão grande, mas esse preparo e o espalhar, porque quanto mais gente sabe do que está acontecendo, mais fácil fica, porque confiança, eu costumo brincar como médico, que é a coisa mais transmissível do que sarampo. Porque se eu disser, telefonar lá para casa, para os meus parentes, e disser que Mohamed é para receber lá em casa, eles vão abrir a porta e colocar dentro de casa sem perguntas, porque confio em mim, a minha confiança passa. Então, no momento que a gente conquistou uma família venezuelana ou haitiana, elas mesmas já fazem essa transmissão muito rápida para todas as comunidades e para os outros que chegam.
Okay, so I agree with my colleagues on what they said, and I don't want to repeat, and I want to add another level of discussion. So the point, actually, we need to talk about colonization and decolonization. if we don't start from this very fundamental differences in paradigm, and we say to all leaders of humanitarian work, we are different in the paradigm. And we have the right to share, not only to do some modification, but we need to share the right for definitions, knowledge, resources, decisions, and evaluation. And I think in current situations, it is difficult because they have the money. And if you start to, actually they praise you if you become courageous, but if you dare to go outside what is, acceptable, they will exclude you. So my work is now is you need to have local funding mechanisms that is culturally bounded or faith bounded to implement this project of mental health and psychosocial support. And then you can talk with them and show them how effective when you really respect and take into consideration this faith component. So this is what I think is the solution, and I hope they will realize, that this is how you apply the guidelines. That is, we all agree on it actually, and we study, but to translate it to applications need more courageous actually to do that. This is, and for the education, I just want to add, education has two directions. Education itself can have a good mental health effect for children, so it is very important. And also integrating faith and mental health into education is very important. We had experience in integrating mental health, peace building in schools, and it was very successful project actually. So we need to think about integration and to do activities not isolated, but included in education, in maybe mosque or churches, or do it in where people are living. And this is what even UN has discovered after 20 years of saying that we do friendly spaces, child-friendly spaces. They discovered this is not a good idea. We need to go to where children are and provide this. So education is very, very important. Thank you.
I think this is such a great conversation, and I think the dialogue and the conversation about the locally led approaches, locally, it's huge, and I think it's something that's actually guaranteed by all of these global charters. I think this is something that we've been learning even in the last few years, just to say there is movement, right? Like, before COVID, if you had mentioned children, the words children, faith, and mental health in the same sentence, you would have been kicked out of the room, right? And now we're in these global policy conversations with the head MHPSS leads from WHO, from UNICEF, from UNHCR, who are all fully committed to faith and culturally sensitive approaches. Now, to your point, there is a missing middle. What does that mean? How do we do that? How do we do this more effectively? And I think one of the processes that we've been working on together, many of us, and we hope we can expand to others in this room, is this mapping. You know, it sounds like a lot of you have different experiences. Definitely everyone at this table does. I recognize people who I know are working in this space. And we're going to go in a couple of minutes. We're going to show at the very end, we're going to show a video from Dr. Rutledge that will introduce a faith mapping process. So to capture these good practices, to continue to tell the story and build momentum around what's actually working locally. How do we do more of what's happening with the Yazidis, what's happening in Syria? We have a policy brief that was recently translated locally by our mental health practitioners in the region into Arabic. So now it's available in English, Spanish, also translated by MHPSS practitioners in the region. And so I think there's a lot of themes that have come up that really reinforce this global conversation that we've been having, that this is a really exciting part of. So I want to pass, should we go to the video first and then?
Eu acho que podemos passar para o vídeo e eu encerro depois.
Can we go to the final slide in the PowerPoint deck? There's one more short video. And then, even now, she's going to introduce this QR code. If everyone wants to take a picture of this QR code, oh, yes. If you have examples, if you have friends that have examples, it'll be the opportunity. But she'll introduce in the video a little more about the kinds of things that you're looking for. It's a very simple form, and will involve some follow-up and conversations about these approaches. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. And the policy brief is available on the PARD website. If you just go to PARD, partnershiponreligiondevelopment.org, Google it, and then look at the faith-sensitive MHPSS form.
Faith-sensitive and culturally sensitive and adapted MHPSS. PARD, over the last couple of years, has been working on several different activities to strengthen what's available to children on the move and to their caregivers and to adults. And the policy brief that's going to be talked about today is one part of that. And over a period of about a year, more than 54 agencies, governments, United Nations.
No? Okay. Well, I'll give then just 30 seconds more information. So what we have an evidence agenda around this because, as we know, to further find funding for these sorts of things, to make sure that we're knowing programmatically what works, how to ensure good practice. We want to both know what is already out there in the academic literature. We've done some lit reviews, but we also want to learn about what's happening at the community that maybe hasn't been written up in a peer-reviewed journal, but really are these effective approaches, as everyone has shared. And so this process will be really important. In the gray literature, we can talk to you. We'll have researchers in Spanish who are fluent in Spanish, English, and Arabic, but also willing to accept things in other languages, and want to do as comprehensive of a review as possible to inform a broader evidence agenda. So with that, thank you. Flavia.
Bom, é importante, né, ao encerrar essa sessão, nós pensarmos na garantia dos direitos da criança e do adolescente em cada contexto dos países que recebem essas crianças em deslocamento forçado, de tal forma que a gente possa promover os direitos dessas crianças e adolescentes, operando uma articulação, né, das suas culturas, compreendidas a partir dos parâmetros das políticas sociais dos países que estão recebendo essas crianças e adolescentes em deslocamento forçado, né? Então, compreender seus modos de vida a partir das suas identidades espirituais, das suas cosmovisões, com as suas expressões religiosas, é uma garantia de um direito dessa criança e adolescente e permite um processo de acolhimento psicossocial em termos de compreender uma das dimensões da subjetividade que pode ser, né, o âmbito das suas crenças, né. Agora, para o Estado, né, em termos de regulação das políticas sociais, é importante garantir a laicidade, né, num diálogo interreligioso, em que não há nenhuma forma de obrigatoriedade de adesão a uma outra expressão religiosa dessa criança e adolescente como contrapartida para que ela receba o atendimento psicossocial e em toda a rede de atenção. Já a possibilidade de um acolhimento psicossocial em termos de dimensões das entidades sociocomunitárias, filantrópicas e confessionais de alguma expressão religiosa nos países, ela pode ser oferecida de acordo com o parâmetro jurídico desse país. No caso do Brasil, na Constituição Federal de 1988, a promoção e garantia dos direitos das crianças e adolescentes pode ser oferecido pelo Estado brasileiro em diálogo com a sociedade civil organizada. Parte da sociedade civil organizada são as instituições religiosas. Então, elas podem prover, né, um suporte socioafetivo para essas crianças e adolescentes em mobilidade forçada, desde que, né, respeite, né, as suas crenças, né, e ofereça, então, um suporte mais em termos de um cuidado baseado, né, em alguma dimensão de compaixão, né, em uma rede sociocomunitária, mas desde que não se oponha, em nenhum momento, às premissas do Sistema Único de Saúde, do Sistema Único de Assistência Social, do Estatuto da Criança e Adolescente e de outras dimensões jurídicas das políticas sociais garantidas pelo Estado brasileiro. Em outros países, obviamente, existirão outras, né, possibilidades e parâmetros jurídicos reguladores das políticas sociais. De todo modo, é importante que também a gente rompa com as barreiras linguísticas, né? No Brasil, nós temos ações interprofissionais, articulando várias entidades em rede, elas são transdisciplinares, e as universidades e também a política pública de educação oferece um tipo de atenção especial à vulnerabilidade dessas crianças e adolescentes em deslocamento forçado e oferece às suas famílias, no caso de adultos, possibilidades de cursos de extensão de línguas estrangeiras e também de processos seletivos especiais com editais específicos para ingresso nas universidades públicas brasileiras, na graduação e na pós-graduação. Assim como essas crianças e adolescentes também podem aprender a língua portuguesa e serem acolhidas no sistema público de educação brasileira, na sua educação básica, que também é um mecanismo de proteção social que garante saúde mental e coletiva a partir da sociabilidade. Então, nós agradecemos muito. Eu retorno a palavra para a Andréia, né, para encerramento, ou se ela quiser fazer mais algum comentário. Esperamos que daqui a gente possa construir, né, uma maior complexidade dessa rede de cuidado à atenção psicossocial da criança e adolescente, nessa dimensão interreligiosa, sempre com uma base do Estado laico, de forma a garantir efetivamente, então, a liberdade religiosa como suporte da atenção psicossocial. Muito obrigada.
Maybe let's give our panelists 1 minute each, one last word. Call to action, anything?
Okay, so first I want to thank Bart actually for this opportunity, and I will encourage all participants here to maybe sign up to be a member of Bart. Okay, so because we are working in very important topic like this. Second, this is first time for me to be in the southern part of the globe, and I'm proud it is in Brazil, And I would thank people of Brazil of welcoming attitudes. And actually, always Brazil has big name, not only for their football famous, but also the inspiring story of your president. So yeah, I'm very proud actually to be here in Brazil, and I hope that I can visit again this country. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Vou aproveitar para falar do Toolkit, que foi lançado em novembro do ano passado, feito por um consórcio, né, com muitas entidades e das diversas religiões. Um trabalho muito bacana, no sentido de como é que a gente pode, como autoridades e pessoas religiosas, diminuir a violência intrafamiliar especialmente. Ele está sendo finalizado agora a avaliação para a Universidade de Notre Dame, Brasil, México, Índia e Paquistão. Até onde a gente viu, pelo menos no Brasil, foi muito bem aceito. E seria algo muito interessante, e a gente percebeu, até para nossa surpresa, que a gente trabalha em mais de 2.000 municípios aqui no Brasil, temos 24.000 voluntários, muito bem preparados, mas como a hora que você começou a conversar essas coisas mais sensíveis, as mães desmoronaram. E a gente percebeu que mesmo com aquilo que a gente achava que era um acompanhamento muito interessante, faltava algo, e esse toolkit, essa caixa de ferramentas deve ajudar bastante, já ajudou, mas a gente espera que seja uma oportunidade também para ampliar essa segurança mental das nossas crianças e famílias.
I echo enormous gratitude for everyone on the panel. I learned a lot from you, and PARD, and IF20, and Brazil. Thanks all around to everyone. Action items, my love language. If you are part of an NGO in the audience, let's partner. If you are not, and you're learning about our program for the first time, follow us on Instagram. You'll see the photos I shared. Share them in your networks and say, hey, I learned about faith-sensitive MHPSS today, and let's get the message out. Someone in your network might need it. But most of all, let's partner. Bellwether is keen to share our framework and adopt it to any and all countries, validate it, whatever needs to happen. It's going to take all of us to working together to really confront issues like genocide, climate change, you name it. Polycrisis is going to require poly collaboration. So I'm serious. If you want to partner, Bellwether typically doesn't say no to partnership. So we're here to help.
Nós agradecemos muito, né, ao Nelson, né, ao Mohamed, né, minha companheira de moderação, Andréia. Eu, Flávia, me sinto honrada de ter participado com vocês nessa sessão, e todas vocês que participaram aqui conosco, nós agradecemos. Agradecemos também a toda a organização, especialmente, né, ao convite do Rodrigo, e também do Ivo. Né. Esperamos que possamos nos reunir outras vezes com esse objetivo maior, né, de garantir a proteção integral de crianças e adolescentes nessa articulação de um diálogo interreligioso com um campo ético, né, e uma política democrática, sempre em defesa da dignidade humana, especialmente de crianças e adolescentes, que são os grupos mais vulneráveis na nossa sociedade, sobretudo diante de situações de violência, opressão, guerras, etc. Muito obrigada.